Author Raymond Ibrahim joins us now with more on the war against Christians. Raymond, you've called the persecution of Christians a humanitarian crisis. Explain, why that?
It's a humanitarian crisis because all around the Islamic world, from one end to the other, from Morocco in the west to Indonesia in the east, Christians are being persecuted first and foremost just because they're Christian, because of their religious identity, because of their desire to go to churches. And it's a humanitarian crisis, and in my opinion, one of the worst, if not the worst, because no light has been shed onto it by the mainstream media and by many humanitarian rights organizations, because apparently Christians are just not popular enough to talk about them. And I think based on the sort of education and the, from the small classrooms to college.
Is there a bias there?
There's definitely a bias, yeah. and that's the whole point. There's a media bias that doesn't want to deal with it, that just wants to brush it aside. And I think the reason for that is because if they say the truth, if they report the truth, which is that basically Christians are being persecuted. I mean, when they go to a church just to pray, and they're already politically ostracized, they're minorities, they have no power, and then they get bombed. The conclusion is this is just pure religious Islamic hostility for a non-Muslim. And so it's very difficult for the mainstream media to actually rationalize that the way they do with other Islamic violence. So Muslims are attacking Israel. Well, that's because they're frustrated, they're angry, they have grievances. Muslims attacking the West or in Europe, they're angry, they're underdogs. But now they're in the majority, and their minorities are being attacked in way worse ways from a humanitarian point of view than Muslims are by Israel or by the United States. And so it kind of throws a wrench in the mainstream media narrative.
What role does Islamic teaching play in provoking greater violence?
It plays a fundamental role. If in the book, for instance, or what I discuss about what's happening to Christians, I don't just discuss the different themes and patterns. So, for example, I'll talk about churches being attacked, bombed, and outlawed, Muslims who wish to apostatize and become Christians being attacked, executed, Christians saying the wrong word about Islam, blasphemers being attacked. So all these themes come out. And yet, if you go back, as I try to do, and you look at the historical sources and the doctrinal sources from over a millennium ago, you're going to find the same exact teachings. So the continuum or the continuity is just undeniable. And that's why it's, if you want to be honest, what's happening right now is just a mirror reflection of what happened yesterday. And therefore, it's part of the authentic teachings of Islam. You can't deny it.
Well, tell me, why do Muslims persecute Christians then more than people of other faiths?
There's a number of reasons for that. The first one is because throughout the Islamic world, there are way more Christians living in Muslim majority countries than other peoples. And one of the reasons for that, of course, ironically, is that in the Islamic conquest, the vast majority of lands that the Muslims took over by force in the jihad beginning in the 7th century were Christian. So you still have large remnants. For example, in Egypt, the Copts, they're the indigenous Christians. That nation was entirely Christian. So now you still have millions of them still around. But another reason is actually a lot of religions, chief among them Islam, actually teach their adherents that if you come under threat because of your religious belief, you are obligated, not just permitted, sometimes obligated to actually lie and say, I'm not a Muslim and I renounce Islam. And that's okay according to Islamic law because you're saving your life. But Christianity is one of those religions that from day one with Christ and Pilate, it won't utter any words, it'll offend the authorities, it won't conform, and then what happens is you get persecuted. So that sort of thing is also at play in the Islamic world where you have different minority, Baha'is in Iran are sometimes persecuted, but they also are well known to dissemble their beliefs and hide it and actually oftentimes say we're not. But Christians generally, traditionally don't do that. And so they really stand out. And then that's also seen as an affront to Islam. You have the audacity. You're not willing to just cave in. You're up here and putting a cross in my face. And then that even provokes more persecution.
And this persecution is so intense, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom has warned that there is an unprecedented exodus of Christians from the Middle East. Right. If it continues, they say, in Afghanistan and Egypt, no more Christianity there. Right. What are your thoughts? How can we reverse that?
How we can reverse that? That's the question. The first way, of course, is knowledge. Most Americans, because of the mainstream media's underminings, are very ignorant about the reality. So the first thing, of course, is to get people to know, and then naturally, if people know and if they care, that they will reach out to their representatives. And there's also a lot of human rights organizations that do focus on this. But we just need to get people on board by first explaining the narrative to them and letting them know. Because you're right, look at a country like Egypt, which was actually a historical center of Christianity. with a lot of intellectual, theological giants coming out of the Origin.
One of the earliest churches.
Clement, earliest churches. And now, like you're saying, they're about to disappear, Christians. And all around the world, this is what's happening. Anywhere in Islam, whether it's Mali, whether it's in Egypt, whether it's in Pakistan, whether it's in Iraq, Syria, it's the same exact pattern. And we're reliving history because this is what happened also when the Islamic conquest came in. All the people either converted because they had to, or they lived, the few of them, as subjugated dhimmis, and the descendants are living there now, or they ran away. And right now, you're seeing all of these patterns. People are converting because they don't want to deal with it, or they're running away, or they're just living in misery.
Now, what responsibility does this administration have here in America if we're not responding to this? Matter of fact, some people are even critical of the Obama administration for supporting the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt.
The Obama administration has not only ignored this humanitarian crisis, it's enabled it in several ways. And the main way it's done that is its wholesale support for the so-called Arab Spring. If you look at the Arab Spring in every single country that it's gone to, Egypt, Libya, now in Syria, Tunisia, all of these countries have taken a nosedive from a humanitarian point of view. And one of the most obvious ways of seeing this is, of course, seeing how Christians are being treated. So in Libya, for example, which you had Gaddafi, not a great guy, obviously, but he was a secularist, and he himself was combating Islamic jihadis because they want him out of the picture just as well. So at least that's why most people don't understand why the U.S. has always supported dictators, because their enemies were our enemies
too. Look at the alternative.
Exactly, and that's why we supported Mubarak for 30 years. But then Obama, under the mainstream media narrative, Arab Spring, they're going to become free and liberal, and they're going to have a secular democracy, and he went along with that, and he said that's what it is. So he knocked Mubarak out. He helped the Muslim Brotherhood go in, and that's the granddaddy organization of every single Islamic organization, including the jihadi ones.
So was he naive, or did he really understand what was going to happen?
I don't think he's naive, because of all U.S. presidents, I can say George Bush was naive because he doesn't know what's going to happen in Iraq. He really buys into the narrative of democracy will bring them more freedom. But of all U.S. presidents, Barack Obama, his father's from Kenya, okay, and he's a Muslim, his father. And Obama was educated in Indonesian schools and madrasas, Islamic schools.
Sunni Islam.
Sunni Islam, which is really the bulk of the persecution is from Sunni Islam. And those two countries, Indonesia and Kenya, figure very prominently in my book as places where it's very severe for Christians. So to me, a person like Obama, at the very least, should have some cognizance and awareness of what's happening in these areas to Christians, because he has actually a direct lineage, a background there. And yet he kind of played along with the narrative that, no, all we want, if we just give them freedom, then they'll be great. And, look at Libya. Right now, there were always very small Christian minority under Gaddafi. And now the rebels that the U.S. backed out are killing them, are
imprisoning them,
torturing them. There's a picture where they took 100 cops that were working there, shaved their heads. They look like Holocaust victims. And they burned the crosses with acid, and one of them died.
But this hasn't always been the case. You mentioned in the book that there was a golden age of Christianity, about a 100-year period. Then it came to an end. Right. Why did it come to an end?
Well, I think this is one of the most important points in my book, which I call lost history. Basically, what happened is Islam has always been the religion of might makes right. From the very beginning, this was the appeal of Muhammad. He became strong on the battlefield. He got booty and plunder, and that's what the Arabs were doing. And then he said, God is on my side, and that went on for centuries. And they conquered lands, and everyone was, of course, Islam must be right. Look, we're powerful. So it has that might makes right mentality. Then in 1798, the unprecedented happened. Napoleon, a Western infidel, came and just devastated Egypt in a war, which was not expected. And so that era, as I argue in the book, and the colonial era and even the post-colonial era, ushered in a whole new idea to the Muslim world, which is basically that, these guys are onto something, the West. They're stronger than us or more advanced technologically. So Muslims very much secularized during this era, and they became westernized. And if you look at my parents from Egypt, for example, if you look at pictures from their era in the 40s, you'll think it's Europe. Every man's in a suit, every woman's in dress, high heels. No one's wearing a hijab.
No veils.
Nothing. Nowhere. And that was because in that era, Muslims were just they were following the right way, the Western way. The Islamic way was obviously the antiquated old way.
But don't they still long for that?
They do.
Many places of the parts of the Middle East.
Of course, there's a lot of Muslims who are nominal or secular, however you want to put it, who do want that. And these are, in Egypt, for example, only 50% voted for Morsi, and the other 50% didn't. So that, I mean, that's hopeful right there. That shows you half of the population. Of course, a lot of them were Christian Copts.
A lot of them didn't vote, so it really wasn't half.
And a lot didn't vote either.
Quarter, maybe.
Right. Yeah. So a lot of these people. But just to finish that point, then something happened is in the West, our culture took a nosedive in the 60s. And it's no coincidence that the Islamic fundamentalism and 1979 revolution comes on the heels of the sort of liberal takeover of American mainstream culture. And so when America became much more liberal and apologetic for itself and multicultural, and it saw its own heritage as a source of all ills, that naturally created revulsion to Muslims, who then, emboldened, said, you know what, our way is the right way, the Islamic way. And so that's really the resurgence of Islam, and that's why it started, and most people don't think that. And it's ironically, it's a vicious circle. We think they're angry because we need to appease more. And ironically, the more you appease, the more you get contempt.
So they basically said, hey, these guys aren't worth following.
No, exactly. Look at them. They
They're
can't.
not
They have no faith in themselves. Yeah. They look at their morality, their sexual licentiousness. We don't want any part of this. Obviously, our way is the right way.
I notice in the book you also mentioned the conditions of Omar. Tell me, what are the conditions of Omar briefly?
Sure.
And why is it being applied today?
The conditions of Omar is a historical text that's attributed to the second Caliph Omar, and it was basically ratified with a conquered Christian community in the 7th century. And it laid out basically what you as a Christian, or what came to be called a dhimmi, what's responsible from you if you want to live unmolested without being killed. And it laid out a number of debilitations and what by our standards would be considered, you know, humanitarian just abuses. For example, you can't build a church, you can't worship too loud, you can't repair a church, you can't show a cross around a Muslim, you can't bury your dead near Muslims in a Muslim cemetery. You can't talk about religion around Muslims. If a Muslim comes and wants your seat, you have to give it to him. So it's a historical text, and it formed the backbone of the treatment of Christians and other non-Muslims living under Islamic hegemony. And so while I quote it, and it's a historical text, throughout the book, I show all these different patterns that conform today to what it says, identically.
Why now, Raymond?
Why now?
Yeah.
Because of this global Islamic resurgence that's underneath the guise of the Arab Spring, underneath the guise of multiculturalism, underneath the guise of it's great. And in fact, all it is, here's the thing, if Islam comes back, Islam will do what Islam did. And so in the book, you'll see that, well, Christians were persecuted for centuries, and it stopped during that golden age we were discussing. But now, as Islam reclaims its heritage, reclaims its identity, reclaims its teachings, we're going to see the same exact things again. And so the same identical patterns of Christian persecution, as for one example, that you see. And this is what I try to do, is show you the continuity and the patterns. I'll show you an example of how Christians were attacked in 7th century because of certain circumstances. 1st century in the same circumstances, same kind of attack, same almost verbatim speeches. And so it's this unwavering continuity that I think is ultimately demonstrative of what we're dealing with.
So nothing new. We've
Nothing
been there,
new.
done that before.
It's nothing new. No.
And the persecution will continue in Europe.
And the persecution will continue. The only thing new is that the West is just completely blind, because at least the Crusades, for example, which have been so demonized and misrepresented in academia. I mean, the Crusades now are always seen as just, we project sort of these postmodern, Western, cynical standards, just a bunch of white, greedy, hypocritical Christians who wanted to go and conquer. You read the sources and you find out, well, you know what? Actually, that happened right after especially severe waves of Christian persecution where, among other things, the Church of the Sepulchre was destroyed and Copts and other Christians were being butchered left and right. And if you read what they said, Pope Urban, that was the reason. We want to go help our brothers in Christ. And so, this is the disconnect between the West. They don't get that. And if anything, the Crusades are evil. They won't tell you that, they went and fought and liberated Jerusalem, and that Jerusalem was actually Christian for hundreds of years before Islam came. It's almost as if, well, Islam was always there and they were peaceful, and then these crazy European guys came and decided to take it. So there's so much disingenuity going on and distortions that your average American, I think, is completely lost. And I hope, to some extent, the book opens some eyes.
Well, it's a wonderful book. I enjoyed reading it. I recommend it to anyone. Again, the book is Crucified Again, Exposing Islam's New War on Christians. Yeah. Raymond Ibrahim, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Gary. Appreciate it.